Good morning, everybody. Y'all are riled up this morning. This is awesome. I love it. Welcome to Hope Church. My name is Joel. I'm one of the pastors here. And as you can tell, like Cameo said at the beginning, this is Family Worship Sunday. Every month it has 5 weeks in it. On that fifth Sunday, we don't do any kids service down there. We have them in here in the main service with us. And we just have a blast, and it's like crazy and distracting. There's kids crying and laughing and dropping things, and it's good, and we welcome it. We love it. Parents, if your kids are with you, like, don't be in your head if they're loud or if they're doing it. It's all good. It's what we expect. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't distract me. I can talk over whatever. I love to talk, so it just happens, regardless of what's happening. So don't worry about it, okay? Don't feel like you need to leave. If obviously, there's like a blowout or something, you can leave and change the diaper and stuff. But I just have to give a shout out to Allie, dude, for like singing with a baby on you like that. I don't know what it is with moms and their ability to multitask while like holding a baby. But if you ever play my wife in mini golf, number one, she'll beat you regardless. But if she has a baby on her chest, like in a carrier, dude, she will wax you. She's never been beat. With a baby on her chest, never been beat. And we have 5, so there's always a baby on her chest when we're playing. But it blows my mind. So, Allie, congrats. That was awesome. You guys are the best. Kids, I'm so glad you're in here with us this morning. I have a quick question for the kids in the room. Do any of you, and you can raise your hand, do any of you have like a special place that you like to go to that's kind of feels like a magical place, or like it's kind of like your own little hideaway? Any kids have something like that you go to, like at your house or your yard? Eddie Mae, you do? Glenn, you do? Not a kid, but yeah. Thomas? Yeah. Do any of you like to build forts? Like blanket forts, tree houses, things like that? And at least, yeah, it's super fun, right? And we kind of have these little places where we like to go. When I was a kid, I remember one of my sets of grandparents lived in a little town called Lansdale, right outside of Philadelphia. And we'd go there, and my grandparents didn't really have much to play with, like, for kids that were there. They had, like, Gunsmoke VHS tapes in the basement that I could watch, or a Game Boy with, like, one game. And you guys remember the Game Boys? Yeah, it's like the Nintendo Switch, but not. And so anyways, like, yeah, if kids saw it now, they'd be like, this is like a piece of paper. Like, what is this? And so anyways, so when I'd get done playing Game Boy for like 6 hours, I went, and there was a park next to their house. And I remember as a child, I went to this park one day, and there was a stream, and I was walking along this stream, and it brought me into these woods. And I was walking through these woods, and there were these trees that were just towering over me. And this stream started widening and turning into this creek and turned into this river. And I'm walking along. Nobody's there. I'm like in the wilderness walking through. And there's this big bend in the river. And I get up like right to the edge of it, and it's just like a cliff into this river. And there's ducks on the water. And I'm like, no one's there. It's just me in the woods. And I'm like, somebody called Rand McNally because I got a new spot on the map. Like, no one has found this place, right? Fast forward some years when I became like a young adult, we went and visited my grandparents, and this spot had always been in my head. And I'd always thought about it. Like, I want to go back to that place because it was just so magical. So we went and visited them. I was a young adult. And man, no sooner did we get out of the car in their driveway that I was like, to the park. And I went and I'm walking, I'm like, there's just one stream, so I'm on the stream and I'm walking, and I'm like, this looks more like a sewage runoff than anything. And I'm walking down this park, and I get to the spot where it was the woods, but it's just this little patch of trees and like thorns and like honeysuckle. And then there's like a 7-Eleven that's like 100 feet away that I swear wasn't there when I was a kid. And I'm walking through, and the creek, it like gets a little wider, but not much, and it gets to the bend. I'm like, this is it. And it's like a 2.5-foot mud bank. There's no ducks. Like, there's no pixies flying. It's just a little, like, city park with, like, a sewage runoff. And how many of y'all have had that experience as adults? Like there's something as a kid, you remember this like beautiful memory and you're like, I gotta get back to that. You go back and you're like, I shouldn't have gone back. Like I should have just left it in my head, right? The magic was in my head. I've thought about that story often, I really have, and just this kind of phenomenon that happens as we move into adulthood. And I have to ask myself, is it really that I was wrong in the way that I saw it? Was I like exaggerated in the way that I saw it? Or was it that as a child I was able to see what it was meant to be, what it was supposed to be, the beauty that was actually there? Was it that now, because I'm an adult, I learned to identify everything that was wrong in the world instead of seeing the beauty that was there in it? With adulthood, unfortunately, comes this level of like arrogance and cynicism that's so hard to see through. And I know when my kids are imagining things and they're wanting me to imagine with them, it's like, I'm a really like, I've got a crazy imagination. I'm like a really playful guy. I love to have fun. But even for me, it's really hard for me to like turn my imagination full on and go there. And like my kids are like, okay, you're Tanya. And I'm like, no, I'm not Tanya. I'm Joel, but like I'll play the game. They're like, no, you're Tanya. I'm like, fine, I'm Tanya. And to me, like, to them, I'm Tanya. They're like, I'm not Dad. I am Tanya in that moment. And I got to like work my best to get there with them, right? It's so hard to get into this like imagination state that kids can get into. How many of you kids in the room, do you guys ever watch Bluey? The show Bluey? The show of hands. You watch Bluey? Yeah. Their dad's like, yeah, we watch Bluey, dude. Yeah. Some of you might even have it on your phone right now, like keeping kids quiet. If you don't know Bluey, it's a little show. It's an Australian show, and it's a cartoon about this little dog family, and they all have like Australian accents, and they're super cute. And every episode, there's like this lesson. But the dad in it, his name's Bandit, right? Isn't his name Bandit? Yeah. Bandit. Whenever the kids want to do anything, Bandit's down. Like he is ready to roll in an instant. Any moment, if they want to play keepy uppy, if they want to play dance mode, if they wanted to play like mountain climber, he's just there. And every episode, I just ends with me sitting like misty-eyed on the couch, like, God, I want to be like Bandit. Like he's such a good dad. He can go there, but it's so hard for us as adults to be there. We just have this cynicism and this arrogance that's here as adults that keeps us from seeing so much of the beauty that's around us. With that said, I want to go into Matthew 18, 1 through 5. Cameo read it just a little bit ago. And the disciples, in true fashion, gotta love them, they're having this ridiculous conversation. And it says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a child whom he put among them. So picture Jesus taking the little kid by the shoulders and like bringing him into the middle of the group. And he said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Now this passage, it's been debated ever since it first happened. Like in the first century church, it was debated. Did Jesus mean to welcome the kingdom as though it's a child, or to welcome the kingdom as though you're a child? And like so many things in life, we get to this place where it's like it's either this or that. There's no in between. There's no gray area. And in some things that's true. But in this case, I look at this and I say, it's both. Because it keeps in line with the way Jesus teaches all the time. When Jesus is teaching, he shares something, and at surface value, you're like, whoa, that's beautiful. And then you get deep into it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize. There's so much depth that's there. And that's what we see happening here. So first, to welcome the kingdom as we would welcome a child lines up perfectly with the parables that we looked at a few months ago. We went through a series called Parabolic, where we looked at Jesus' parables in Matthew chapter 13. And in those parables, Jesus, this thread in which he's teaching is that there's this small, seemingly insignificant thing that's taken and then it grows into fullness and completeness. And when we look back in ancient times, kids unfortunately had even less status than they have today. Sorry, kids, but it's true. And because of the high mortality rate for kids, it was very common for families, for parents, to keep kind of an emotional distance from their youngest kids as kind of a safeguard for themselves because they didn't know if they were going to make it past like infancy and young childhood. And then once they got to a certain point, then it was kind of like, okay, I think they're like good, they're going to make it. But because of that, children had zero status in society. And so if we fast forward to now, that's not the case here, at least in the West, in the U.S. particularly. And so typically when we think of a child like running up to us, how does one typically respond or welcome that child? If you're not one of those people that says like, I just don't like kids, which you're one of those people that's kind of, I'm always like a little leery when people say that, because kids are awesome. But how do we typically welcome a child? It's very similar to the posture that we did during our Love Week in the Advent series of this kind of like on the knees, hands out, like welcoming this child that's running to us, and we pick it up, and maybe if you're like me, throw it up super high. I like to throw our kids way up in the air and see how close I can get their head to the ceiling, which is like dangerous, but I like it. It's like a fun game we do, and I've not hit the ceiling yet. Well, one time it was a garage door. It was fine. They're good. But you throw them up, maybe you hug them, you kiss them, like if they're yours, and you just hold them tight, and you love them. That's how we're to be welcoming this kingdom into our lives. We welcome it like this mustard seed, like this bit of yeast, like this child, and committing to cultivating and loving and nurturing this thing and seeing it grow in our lives and come to fullness and wholeness and completion. So when it comes to welcoming the kingdom as though we are like children, we'll look at the other side of this coin. If we welcome the kingdom as though we are like children, when we see this, and Jesus says this, he says, unless you change and become like these little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And in Jesus saying this, it is, we hear it and we're like, oh, that's cool, that's sweet, we get that. To them, they do not get what he's saying in that. Because you never, during this time, used a child as an example to be modeled or emulated. You didn't do it. No one did it. And so Jesus, in saying this, to become like a child, the disciples would have been like, what are you talking about? Like it wouldn't have registered to them. And so he's making this huge statement. And he's not saying for us to be childish, right? Like, I want the kingdom now. Like, that's not how we welcome it. He's saying to be like a child in regard to humility, that we are entering the kingdom in this humble state, recognizing that we bring nothing special to the table that God has to have or needs. He wants us there. To welcome the kingdom as though we are children keeps perfectly in the theme with the kingdom belonging to those who are poor and powerless and broken and hurting, those who have no status. And becoming like a child, we are entering into that statuslessness, which is not a word, but it's fun to say. That statuslessness, okay? In the next chapter, chapter 19, the disciples are still being dumb and like trying to keep kids away. And it says, then little children were being brought to him, Jesus, in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. And the disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, probably like, listen, man, Jesus is busy. We got a guy over here with a foot fungus that's like, you wouldn't believe, okay? He's got to heal this. Keep your kids over there, right? And they're like trying to keep people from bringing their kids to him. And what's Jesus say? Jesus says, let the little children come to me. Don't stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. To such as these, meaning people like these little people with no status, to welcome the kingdom as though we are children is to enter into that statuslessness. We're saying the only thing that I can bring to the table is complete and total sacrifice of my life and saying, God, do with me what you will. Use me how you see fit. When I think about this, I think about the opportunities when I get to share like stories from scriptures with my kids. And I love it. It's so fun because we get to talk about all these like incredible stories throughout Scripture, and their eyes light up with just this awe and wonderment, and they're like asking questions, and they're like, whoa. And Micah tells really cool stories. He's been a bunch of different places around the world, and he tells stories of like when he shared the gospel with people who have never heard the gospel, and they're like, what? He died? He can't die. And then Micah's like, yeah, but he rose again. They're like, what? Like, it's just like insane. And to us, we've become so calloused to this thing, right? But kids, when they hear this, they're like, man, their eyes just light up wide. Last week, we had the opportunity, I said this before, but before every service, our staff, we get together and we pray together for the Sunday. And last week was a pretty heavy morning. I asked Cameo's permission to share this, and she said it was good. Cameo came into that prayer just really heavy-hearted. A close family friend of theirs, her dad's best friend of 40 years, was passing. And he was on his deathbed, and virtually every part of his body had shut down except his heart. And there was no quality of life. And they had gotten to a place where they were like having to just pump fluid out of him. And the doctor said, nothing else is working, but his heart is so strong, we don't know how long this could go on for. It was just torture for the family to watch, for the friends to watch. It was awful. And so we prayed. And in that prayer, we said, God, in your perfect, good, holy mercy, just take him home. Just let him come home. And after the service, I got in our van in the parking lot, my wife was gone, so I got like all 5 kids back in the van. And we're sitting there, and I got a text from Cameo that said, hey, I just want you to know, shortly after we prayed, Dave passed. And I sat there for a minute. I looked at my phone, and I was like, whoa. And my kids are like, what? I'm like, whoa. Like, Dad, what? And I tell them the story, and my girls are like, for real? And first they were like, why'd you pray that? And I'd explain, like, why we prayed that. And then, they're like, man, this is, like, crazy. And so I kind of explained, like, why we prayed that. But then my 9-year-old, Eddie, was like, sometimes I feel like when I'm praying, God doesn't hear me, but he does. And Cameo wrote in that text, God listens and he cares. But the question is this for adults right now, not kids, adults. And don't raise your hand. It's just a rhetorical question. Internally, think about this. How many of y'all, when you hear stories like that, your knee-jerk response is to go, it was just coincidence. Or his heart probably wasn't as strong as the doctors thought it was. It just kind of like happened like that. Like I said, don't just internally think. Like, what's your knee-jerk response when you hear things like that? What if we could approach the scriptures, the gospel, God himself, faith, with childlike awe and wonderment? A couple of nights ago, we had the opportunity to watch The Secret Garden with our girls, our older 2 girls. You guys remember, you ever seen The Secret Garden? You remember that? Yeah, okay. It was like my favorite as a kid, the 90s VHS of it, and I watched it all the time. And in that movie, the garden wasn't like, it was just a beautiful garden. There wasn't really anything special about it other than the fact that it was just really beautiful and this kind of like place the kids would go to escape. Well, in the new 2020 version, which I encourage you to see if you haven't seen it, it's beautiful. Colin Firth is in it. He's a baller. And so it's just this really awesome version. Same storyline, but in this one, when Mary goes to the wall of this garden, she goes over the wall and she goes into this secret garden. You learn very quickly that this garden is actually alive. And as she's walking down the path, the plants that are beside her, she's walking down the path, like curl over her and kind of embrace her as she walks under them. And there's these branches of these like ferns that are blowing in the wind, and as they're green, but then when the light hits them, they turn this like translucent pinkish red color. You see very quickly this garden is alive. And there's a little boy in that story, if you're not familiar with, who can't walk. And when Mary and her friend Craven start to bring Colin into this garden, in the original one, they teach him how to walk. In this one, just being in the garden brings healing. And he starts to be able to walk again. Next week, we're stepping into this journey. I've said it a couple times now. We're going to be rolling out this new vision, but it's more than just a vision. We're stepping into this journey together. And we're going back to this garden. This garden that's full of beauty and splendor and healing and life. The garden where everything began, where everything was supposed to be, where everything is going to end up being. It's a garden that really feels like a fairy tale of sorts. Question for the kids. What's your favorite fairy tale? Mine's Beauty and the Beast. Eddie? What's yours? Oh, I thought we were like Beauty and the Beast buddies. It's not Beauty and the Beast anymore? Dude, this hurts. Anybody else? Kids, favorite fairy tales. What's your favorite story? Okay. Cinderella, so good. Love it. Anybody else? Snow White. So good. It's a good one. But we're going back to this garden. It's like this fairy tale of sorts. I want to look really quick as we're kind of closing out. There's a quote, you may have heard it, it's from a guy named Neil Gaiman, who is the author of Coraline. A lot of times this quote is attributed to a man named G.K. Chesterton. He actually didn't say it. It was kind of a paraphrase of his thoughts. He said this: fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. When we look at this gospel, we see a story that resembles many fairy tales that we know. But the difference is, this one is true. It's not a fairy tale. And we're going to be recovering this story of a king who always was and always will be the most loving king, the only king. And he built this kingdom, this garden kingdom. It didn't look like a normal kingdom. He built this garden kingdom, and he created man and woman. And he wanted them to live with him in this garden in just perfect harmony. Eternity forever in this garden with him. But the man and woman said, nah, we want to be our own king and queen. We want to set up our own kingdom and go over here. So as heartbroken as this eternal king was, he said, okay. And so they went. And for centuries and years, war raged on, and men and women lived in this kingdom of darkness that always had this storm cloud over it. And there was always sounds of crying and hurting and hatred and people being mean and war and famine and people going hungry. And all the while, this good, perfect, loving, eternal king is saying, come back into this garden kingdom. Come back. And in that span, we see giants in the story, and we see kings and queens and kingdoms and prophets and miracles and mountains on fire. And we see this people group hurting and crying out for rescue. And so this good and loving and perfect eternal king sends his son, a prince, to come and rescue these people. But he doesn't come like any normal prince that we know. He doesn't come with sword on horseback and a shield. That's for later. He didn't come like that the first time. He comes what? As a baby, meek and mild. And he lives this life, grows into a man, and what does he do to rescue these people who would now become his bride? He gives his life. He gives his life, but he doesn't stay dead. He slays the dragon named Death. He slays the dragon named Death by coming back to life. And he tells his bride, listen, I have to go away for a little bit to take care of some things, but you're not alone. You're going to have my spirit with you, living with you, and I'm coming back. And this prince is going to be returning. And so all the while, this bride is now singing this, someday my prince will come, right? That's not original with Cinderella or whoever sang that. It's not original. Church has been singing that since the beginning. Entrusting us with the job of caring for this kingdom, of building and expanding this garden kingdom, bringing life back into the world, helping and loving our neighbors, loving our enemies, building this kingdom until this prince finally returns again as king, finally in eternity forever, with this garden kingdom being here in full. That's the story of the gospel. It sounds like a fairy tale, but it's true. And we're going to be recovering this story. We love fairy tales because it's in our DNA. This story is in our DNA. And so we're going to be going back to this garden, stripping all the things away that have been added on through the years, added on to us through experience and trauma and whatever outside, influences, and getting back to the core of what this says and what this is teaching us. And my prayer is that as we approach it, we can approach it with childlike awe and wonderment, with eyes wide open, ready to receive what God has for us like we are children again. Let's pray.